Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. For years, the FDA has been criticized for dragging its feet on tobacco harm reduction. But in January, the agency moved fast, authorizing 20 Zyn nicotine pouch products after an extensive scientific review. Just weeks earlier, experts at Rutgers warned that slow regulation could lead to a black market surge, much like what happened with e-cigarettes. Did the FDA take their advice? And does this signal a shift in how nicotine alternatives are regulated? Joining us today to unpack these questions is Kevin Schroth, a lawyer, associate professor at Rutgers School of Public Health, and a tobacco control expert. He's here to break down what this decision means and whether the FDA got it right and what's next for nicotine regulation. Professor Schroth, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
So first off, let me ask, is the FDA authorizing 20 Zyn nicotine pouch products a win?
I think this is a step in the right direction. The FDA has this process. It's supposed to act as a gatekeeper that allows products to be sold in U.S. markets. And what we've seen in some respects is that the FDA has been quite slow in authorizing these products, so much so that we haven't seen evidence that it's doing its job to a sufficient extent that people embrace that and accept that. And here, the FDA is authorizing a popular product. It's a product that has a low health risk profile. It has fewer harmful constituents by far than combustible tobacco products. So we think that this is a positive sign that the FDA is enforcing its laws.
Before we dive any deeper, you've spent years in public health law and tobacco control. What drew you to this field?
You might say that I'm a retired attorney. I worked in private practice for a number of years. But tobacco specifically had a significant impact on my family. I've lost people who were close to me because of smoking, my father in particular. So it's an issue that has always had a deep resonance for me. And when I came to a point where I felt like private practice of law was not where I wanted to go, I found an opportunity to work with the New York City Health Department, which has been a really interesting move for me career-wise.
Now, you spent a great deal of time actually working for New York Health. What were you doing there?
Well, I was helping the city during the Bloomberg administration and later during the de Blasio administration to develop its tobacco control policy. And while I was there, New York City passed over a dozen tobacco control laws and policies. That includes laws that increased prices for various types of tobacco products, laws that prohibited pharmacies, which are supposed to be places that promote health, from selling tobacco products. We passed laws that reduced the whole overall number of licenses available to sell tobacco products. So we were quite active, and it was an interesting place to work.
Well, working with and for Bloomberg then?
Yes. And working in the Bloomberg administration was really a positive experience where we had a mayor who was really proactive and bought into the concept of public health, literally and figuratively. The fact that he was a billionaire and was willing to put his money into philanthropies and philanthropic activity related to tobacco control didn't hurt either.
Professor Schroth, the Rutgers Institute for Nicotine and Tobacco Studies published a commentary last December in JAMA, which urged the FDA to move quickly on nicotine pouches. 1 month later, the FDA authorized 20 Zyn products. Did Rutgers have the FDA's pulse, or did the FDA follow your lead?
Yeah, that's a funny question in a way. I don't know if we had direct influence on the FDA, but I think we've been watching what the FDA is doing very closely. And To the extent that the FDA might be paying attention to things that we're writing, we're happy to see that, or at least think it might be making a difference.
So, is the decision that the FDA took on Zyn significant, and why?
I think it certainly is significant. The FDA has had this power for a long time to authorize tobacco products when it finds that there's sufficient evidence that they may be appropriate for the protection of public health. And that phrase, appropriate for the protection of public health, is a mouthful. But what it really means is that they're looking for products where there's evidence that it could have a benefit for the population and looking at specifically directed to look at what the potential impact could be on a smoking population and a population that's not using tobacco products. And it has to balance what the impact of an authorization like this could be on different segments of the population. For electronic cigarettes, there was always this significant concern that authorizing electronic cigarettes, especially flavored electronic cigarettes, would increase youth use. And that has led to this phenomenon or this reality where the FDA has been quite slow in dealing with FDA applications related to electronic cigarettes. Now, in the smokeless world, in these nicotine pouch applications, we've seen the FDA arguably act more quickly. But what might drive the difference is that this is a product that doesn't have the alarming levels of youth use.
It's interesting, though, because there are critics on some of the sides politically in the US and actually in Canada, too, as well, that seem to be trying to gin up that scare, saying that there is a potential epidemic of Zyn users in youth. But I don't think we've seen that, have we?
We have not. If you look at the number of people using Zyn products is still relatively low. It's low among young people, and it seems to be higher among adults. But I think the FDA is striking a good course here and saying that they're going to authorize these products, but they're also going to keep an eye on the data. And if youth use were to rise, I'm sure they would reevaluate their decision.
So does the FDA's authorization of these products, does that show that it's embracing nicotine alternatives as a harm reduction tool?
Well, I don't think the FDA gets a lot of criticism, as you pointed out. There's people on both sides of the aisle that are both sides of the public health aisle that are taking shots at the FDA. And I think that the evidence shows that it's really trying to stay true to its directive of looking at this public health standard and authorizing products so long as there's evidence, like clear scientific evidence, that the health risks are low and the risk of youth use is also low. Now, would we like to see the FDA act a little bit quicker? Sure. I think everybody would like to see the FDA act a little quicker. But the reality is that no matter what the FDA does, it's going to be sued for its decisions. So you can't fault them for trying to be cautious.
I should ask, the very concept of tobacco harm reduction is considered by some to be contentious or even an industry plot by big tobacco. What are your thoughts on tobacco harm reduction?
I don't think that it's a useful way of thinking about tobacco harm reduction to think that it could be some kind of an industry plot to addict a new generation of users. I think what's really crucial is that we focus on the science. I mean, we know from decades of data that combustible cigarettes are, frankly, the most dangerous consumer product, the deadliest consumer product in the history of the world. Nothing comes close. And here we have products that have potential to help people break the addiction to cigarettes. And when people make a clean break, that can have significant public health benefits for them. And when I say clean break, um, I mean that we would like to see people that are making a transition away from smoking to become to make a clean break and not become dual users. Dual use is a problem, and we've seen that to a significant extent in electronic cigarettes, where a lot of people who tried to use e-cigarettes to quit ended up in this limbo where they were actually using both products. So they were still getting a lot of nicotine and they were getting the hazardous constituents from combustible tobacco.
Yeah, dual use is one of those areas that certainly of concern. So let me ask you then, so do nicotine vaping products actually, play a role in tobacco harm reduction, smoking cessation? Basically, are they a good or are they a bad?
Well, I think it's hard to say that they're clearly a good or a bad, but I think they have potential for good. And I think there's increasing evidence showing that people can use electronic cigarettes to quit smoking. Um, the caveat is that what we hope to see is first, if people can quit by using FDA approved cessation treatments, that's the first, that's the ideal. We want to see people use FDA approved uh, options first. But a lot of people have tried that and are still unsuccessful. And if that's the case, and e-cigarettes help them to make that clean break from combustible smoking, I think that's a I think that's a certainly a step in the right direction.
So back to Zyn, the FDA's review cited studies showing that many adult smokers switch entirely to nicotine pouches. Does this reinforce the argument that these products reduce harm?
I think it does. If adult smokers are switching completely to nicotine pouches, I think they're reducing the number of harmful constituents that they're exposed to. So I think that that is certainly going to lead to health benefits.
So you were talking about appropriate for the protection of public health. There's many critics that look at the FDA's authorization of Zyn and say, well, why couldn't they apply that same risk benefit analysis to e-cigarettes? Because there is one and it doesn't seem to be applied.
Yeah, I think it's easy again to look at what the FDA is doing and criticize them, but I don't see that there's an inconsistency here. I think the critical factor, the critical difference that separates nicotine pouches from a lot of e-cigarettes is that there is greater risk of youth use. There's greater data showing that youth are using e-cigarettes and flavored e-cigarettes. I think it's important to point out too, though, that the FDA recently authorized 4 menthol flavored e-cigarettes. So while the total number of e-cigarettes that have FDA authorization is still low, at least they can now say that they've authorized a number of products, including some flavored products.
So obviously, I don't need to tell you that there are critics out there that argue that this decision highlights contradictions in how the FDA is approving safer nicotine products.
Yeah, I know that there are these critics out there, but I don't think that it's clear that there's a contradiction. I think we're talking about different products, and there's different bodies of evidence that the FDA can justify the decisions that it's been making. Naturally, I wish the FDA could move a little bit more quickly in some cases, but I do think that they're a well-intentioned group of people who are taking their job seriously and trying to make good decisions.
So I'll just jump to that question I've got on the list that asks whether or not you think FDA is actually, evaluating these products based on science, because we know from like the Reagan-Udall Foundation and a bunch of, kind of leaked memos that have come out that it seems to appear FDA is making some decisions on e-cigarettes with politics in mind.
There's certainly a lot of arguments that have been made by people and a lot of them are in the tobacco industry and the e-cigarette industry. And I'm not convinced that the FDA is making decisions with politics in mind.
So, how would you grade the FDA's approach to the PMTA process for nicotine vapes?
You could say that the FDA gets a D for delay. Um, I I do think that there have it's been kind of stunning how slow this is going. We saw the Juul application go in. The FDA initially issued a denial, and then it suspended its decision, and then it wiped out its decision. And roughly 2 years or more have passed since then. So I don't understand why it's taken so long. Um, at the same time, the FDA is flooded with applications. It's had more than 20 million applications related to new tobacco products. So it does have its hands full. Um, all of that said, I'm heartened by this evidence that the FDA is authorizing products. I In the future, I'd like to see us get to a point where the commercial marketplace reflects what's been authorized by the FDA, but we're not there yet. We're in a position where the FDA has authorized 34 e-cigarettes and now 20 Zyn products. But if you go into any convenience store, you're going to find hundreds of e-cigarettes and many dozens of uh, nicotine pouch products and other smokeless tobacco products. And an enormous number of them don't have FDA authorization. So that's where we want to get. And we still have a long way to go.
So, how do we get there then?
Well, one thing I've been advocating for is that local governments, including attorney generals, state attorney generals' offices, really need to step up and help the FDA. The FDA's resources are somewhat limited, and attorneys general have enormous power to get involved and try to clean up the marketplaces in their various states. Remember, it was the attorneys general that produced the master settlement agreement in 1998. That was 2 years after the FDA had failed to regulate tobacco products. So they stepped up then when the FDA was not at its finest or most successful moment. And just a couple of years ago, uh, attorneys general had a very significant settlement against Juul for marketing their products to young people. And they settled for tens of millions of dollars. Um, in other contexts, like opioids, we've seen attorneys general make significant progress. So I think this is another scenario where we need attorneys general to help clean up, especially the e-cigarette marketplace. Um, but while they're at it, they could look at other types of tobacco products as well.
So, is there anything inherently, I don't want to say wrong, but not practical about the current authorization process? So, some countries like Canada and many in Europe and so forth, they use product standards. So, there's a set of standards, people can manufacture a product, they can enter into the market as long as they meet those standards, but not, this very expensive, highly lengthy process of authorization.
I think that a product standard regime could be a positive thing. The FDA has the ability to issue product standards in the Tobacco Control Act, and it hasn't done that yet. It's proposed a couple of ideas. One was to eliminate menthol in cigarettes, and another was to dramatically reduce nicotine in cigarettes to non-addictive levels. Uh, I've been advocating for those product standards to move forward. It looks like the menthol product standard is not moving forward. That was taken off of a priority list in the FDA or Office of Management and Budget. But there could be other product standards. There could be product standards for e-cigarettes. So I would encourage the FDA to look at those examples that you mentioned.
So could a product standard be in lieu of the PMTA process?
I think that's a possibility. Um, or it could work in conjunction with the PMTA process, so long as products are in compliance with existing product standards. Perhaps that would streamline uh, application processes.
What are your thoughts on the misinformation regarding nicotine vapes? Or do you even agree that there's misinformation out there? What we do know is that more people today believe that vaping is as harmful or even more harmful than smoking.
Yeah, I think that's a significant problem. And I mean, there's evidence that even practicing physicians uh, don't have a good handle on the relative risks posed by e-cigarettes versus combustible tobacco products. As I said earlier, there's no doubt that cigarettes are the deadliest product in human history. And there's also no doubt that e-cigarettes produce significantly fewer harmful constituents. They're not harmless. They do have nicotine. Nicotine is certainly addictive. We could learn more about them, and we will learn more about them over time. There's also a variety of products entering the market, including products that haven't been analyzed by the FDA. These unauthorized products, often coming from China, unregulated, with high levels of flavorings and increasing amounts of nicotine per device. So while e-cigarettes are, pose health risks, they also have potential benefits.
It's always the trade-offs, isn't it, Professor Schroth? Youth vaping concerns led to many states enacting flavor bans and other e-cigarette restrictions, but youth use of nicotine pouches is low. And in fact, actually, the youth vaping has been going down year over year. It's been fairly dramatic, almost 70% less than it was at its height. So how do we square the issue? Like, is it protect youth at all costs, at the expense of adult smokers, or how do you see it?
So I think that states that were going after flavored e-cigarettes should have, and some of them did, but they should prioritize going after flavored combustible tobacco products first. Go out, if you want to go after flavored e-cigarettes, I think it's important, and you're working with a state or a local government, I think you have to look at your book of laws and say, wait a minute, did we prioritize the more dangerous product first? So if you're going to do that, then you look at menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars first. Massachusetts did followed an approach like that. California followed approaches like that. But there were a number of states that went after flavored e-cigarettes without addressing these more dangerous flavored products. I think that's not showing the right priorities. Now, moving on to flavored nicotine pouches, I think the same thing could happen. I don't think that states should prioritize passing laws to ban flavored nicotine pouches unless they have first looked at greater uh, products that pose greater health hazards. And if they've done that, good. Then they can look at flavored nicotine pouches. But as you point out, the numbers of youth using those products is still pretty low. So I don't think that they should be expending their capital, their political capital, on that just yet.
I wanted to get your thoughts on gateway versus common liability. Could you explain that for our viewers?
So ever since e-cigarettes have been on the market, there has been uh, this line or fear that e-cigarettes would prove to be a gateway that would lead to more combustible smoking. And that theory came out when cigarette smoking among young people was probably 15, 17%. And the number has just gone down and down and down, and now we're under 2%. So if e-cigarettes were a gateway for smoking combustible cigarettes, wouldn't we see the emergence of e-cigarettes lead to an increase in smoking? So I think the evidence doesn't back up the idea that e-cigarettes are actually a gateway. You mentioned this common liability theory, and people might be wondering what that really means. But it really means that people experiment. Young people experiment with multiple tobacco products. And yes, it may be possible that some young people that experiment with e-cigarettes also use cigarettes sometimes or experiment with cigarettes sometimes. But when you look at the data carefully, you may find that there could also be a bidirectional relationship. Young people that experiment with cigarettes might subsequently experiment with e-cigarettes. Similarly, people who are experimenting with hookah and cigars and smokeless could subsequently experiment with other tobacco products. So the more you look at the data, you see that there's this phenomenon of experimentation. But at the end of the day, if you're looking to see if experimentation is using to an increase in combustible cigarette smoking, I don't think the numbers show that.
One of the things that we hear often is that there is a switch happening between smoking being the great evil and nicotine now being the great evil. Instead of the end game for tobacco control being ending smoking, it's now turned into ending nicotine. Help us understand that and where you might sit on that issue.
Yeah, I think this gets back to the question that you asked, raising the idea that some people think that the tobacco industry is this nefarious entity or group of entities that are trying to hook the next generation on new products. And they're always creating new products, hoping that they can transition people to a product of the future. And there are financial concerns at stake for sure. The tobacco industry is it's a for-profit industry. But at the same time, we have to look at this as scientists, and we have to look at the risk profile posed by discrete products. And I don't think that it's healthy for people in the public health community to put a spotlight on nicotine products that clearly that clearly pose low health risks and compare them to combustible cigarettes as another example of this nefarious industry. I don't think that's a productive approach.
If you were setting nicotine policy, what's the right balance between regulation and consumer access?
So one thing that I think hinted on earlier is that the FDA, under the Tobacco Control Act, is charged with being this gatekeeper that's supposed to be able to authorize products that are available in US marketplaces. And if you go into the store, if you go into a gas station and you look at the e-cigarettes on the wall, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of e-cigarettes on the wall. Most of them are flavored. Most of them are unauthorized by the FDA. So just focusing on e-cigarettes for a second, I'd like to see us get to a future where there's some alignment between what's regulated and what's available for retail sale. Similar for, and the FDA has work to do here. To the extent that there's products out there that deserve authorizations, I hope the FDA keeps working and processing those applications, and if they're worthy, they get authorized. Similarly, for nicotine pouches, we now have 20 nicotine pouches that have received FDA authorization, but there's a lot of other ones out there. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the FDA grant more nicotine pouch applications in coming months. And again, I would like to get to this future where there's more of an alignment between what's authorized and what's available for retail sale. And that is not something that the FDA can do on its own. As I mentioned earlier, local government plays a role in trying to regulate what's available in the retail stores that they're inspecting. We have tobacco 21 laws that are designed to keep nicotine products and tobacco products out of the hands of people under the age of 21. So we need to see laws like that improved to a greater extent as well.